In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of quilting your quilt sandwich. So you've basted your quilt by now, hopefully, and you're ready to move on to the next step. Normally, quilting is a really big topic. You can really go down a rabbit hole here, but I'm going to try to distill it down as much as I can. I'm not going to make you watch me quilt an entire quilt. No one has time for that, frankly. And I also want to tell you up front that I've run into some logistics issues, so I won't be filming any quilting on my big quilt top on this puppy because it's just not doable by myself or with my current setup, which is very frustrating, and I'm sorry I couldn't figure out a way to get it done. But I will do my best to show you what you need to know using my mini quilts. Just keep in mind when you're quilting a big quilt compared to a small mini quilt like these ones, managing all of that extra fabric is like 70% of quilting a large quilt. And that's not a problem you bump up against when you're doing a mini quilt. There are a few things that I recommend that you do before you start quilting. They are all optional, but I find that I get a nicer result if I do these things. So the first one is put in a new sewing machine needle. It just helps it get through all those layers more easily. You know you don't have a dull blade, and it can help your tension. If you have a hard time getting good tension, your blade might be dull. The next one I do is I clean my machine. So I will unscrew these two screws here, and I'll pop off the needle plate, and I clean all the lint from inside. And this might be a more advanced thing to do, especially if you're not very familiar with your machine. You can have it done professionally. You can take it in to get serviced, or you can do it yourself. If it is your very first time opening up your machine and taking up the faceplate and everything, I recommend you get a camera and you either take pictures or video of everything you're doing so you can know that you're putting everything back in the right place when you're done. But this time when I cleaned my machine, I got a ton of lint. I can't remember the last time I cleaned it, and that's a good sign that I needed to clean it. After I finished cleaning and I screwed my needle plate back on, I switched over to my walking foot, which is going to be different for everyone's machine. The walking foot for this machine is actually sort of built in. So I add this part of the foot, and then this part back here swings down and clips in, which is pretty cool. I like that a lot. But again, a walking foot is optional. You don't need it for quilting, but it does make it a little bit easier and it has less bubbling as you quilt. After I've done all of that, I like to make a little tension tester. So what this is scrap fabric with batting inside. So it's mimicking a quilt top. And then I will test my tension until I get it just right. So up here, over here was my very first, no, actually, the line across to hold the layers together was my very first one. And while it seemed okay on the top, when I flipped it over to the bottom or to the back, you can really see it needed some work. The tension wasn't right. But I finally, with some a little bit of trial and error, I got it just the way I liked it. Another way you can use your tension tester is to test out what stitch length you like to quilt with. And so my machine, this is the stitch width and this is the stitch length, and on my machine it is automatically 2.2, but I actually like to bump it all the way up, to 3 even. And this is just a matter of personal preference. I think it's a little easier to quilt with a longer stitch length. It just sort of accommodates all those layers better, and it just makes for a smoother experience. The last thing I recommend that you do before you start quilting is wind up a bunch of bobbins. So how many bobbins you need is going to vary based on the density of your quilting, how big your quilt is, things like that. So it's hard to say how many bobbins you will need. But it is really nice to have a bunch ready to go so you don't have to stop and unthread your machine and then wind bobbins and then go back and get back into the swing of things. So it's really nice to just pop a bobbin in when you finished another one real quick. When you look at your quilt top, it might be hard to decide where you want to begin, but you can follow the rule that I think most quilters follow, and that's to work from the center out. So since this grid is on the diagonal, I'm going to go from corner to corner, all the way down. So I'll do my first line and go all the way down, and instead of going down to the bottom and then like flipping the quilt all around and then going down again and doing sort of this back and forth motion, you're actually going to go down, then you're going to cut your thread down there, and then pull your quilt all the way back to the start, and you're going to go down, cut your thread, over here, down, cut your thread, and so on to the side. So you'll go from the center, out, then you'll flip your quilt, and then you'll start over. So you'll already have done the center one, so you'll do the next one over, go down, start over at the top, go down, and so on. Okay, so I've made sure to double check my tension. Here it is right there. I check it front and back to make sure it looks good, and then I can get ready and start quilting. So I'm going to scoot this down, 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 until I get to the top over here. And I'm going to make sure and hand advance the wheel. So that's the thing on the side of your machine that moves your needle up and down. I'm going to move it down so that I know it is hitting right where I want it to, right on that line that I marked. Then I'm going to put my presser foot down. And remember, I have my walking foot on here, and I can get started. So I'm going to make sure that I don't have too much tension from the weight of my mini quilt, or especially if you're working on a bigger quilt. You don't want the weight pulling down because it'll be harder to get your quilt fed through the machine, and it can mess with your tension. So some people do that by creating a little bit of a bubble here so that it's easier for it to get pulled through. If you're working on a big quilt, they might throw all of this quilt down here over their shoulder to help regulate the weight of the quilt. But for the mini quilt, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. My biggest challenge here is just staying on the line because I have a camera right in front of my face. You'll also want to pay attention to your hands. So you don't want to put a lot of pressure down and make it harder for the quilt to be fed through. And you don't want to move your hands unevenly. So let's say this hand is going forward faster than this hand. That can make it harder to stay on the line that you marked. So you're going to try to move your hands gently and in tandem, and you're going to be guiding it through, and hopefully you won't have to push it through. It's also a good idea to engage your needle down function if you can, because every time your hands get away from you, you want to stop sewing, pick up your hands, and move them back. If you keep sewing and you move your hands back, then your line can get wobbly and you can get off course. So the way you use your hands is very important here. So here we go. Try to be patient, especially as you're getting used to the process, because when you go quickly, you can make mistakes quickly. And if your quilt is feeling like it's shifting weird, or you want to manage how it's falling in front of the machine this way, or maybe you have a little bit of extra quilt on the side and you want to roll that up, don't feel bad about stopping and readjusting, okay? It's all part of the process. Okay, so here we go. Nice and slow. There is a line here, you just can't see it on camera, but I'm going to continue to follow that line. And I want you to take a minute to readjust your expectations here, because it looks pretty simple following a line, but if you're a beginner, you're not going to get that perfectly straight line that you're expecting. So try to readjust your expectations. We're not looking for perfection, we're looking for progress. Over time, you might also notice that you experience more fatigue than you would imagine, but it can take a bit of muscle to get your quilt through your machine. So make sure and take breaks when you need to. You might, for all I know, be a speed demon, and this might be entirely too slow for you, and you want to go much faster, and that's, of course, totally up to you. Do what you need to do to get your quilt finished. So I'm going to snip those threads, and I'm going to pull my quilt back through, and you can see as I'm going, I didn't quite hit the line all the time. It's still mostly straight, but I did miss my mark once in a while, which is perfectly okay and natural because I am not a robot. And it's okay for your quilt to look like it was made by a human and not by a robot, okay? I'm going to get my thread managed out of the way, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to put my needle down, and I'm going to put my presser foot down, and I'm going to do just the same thing. So I'm readjusting when I need to, and I'm trying to be aware of where my hands are so that I don't inadvertently mess anything up or get it twisted wrong. But I admit there are a lot of balls in the air here. You're monitoring a lot of different things, so it can take a while to get used to juggling all of that. And even now, I have my moments where I completely lose track of what I'm doing, and I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. I should probably move my hands. I should readjust my fabric, that sort of thing. As you work your way farther and farther from the middle of the quilt, working your way out, you'll have more fabric that you'll need to deal with at the side of your machine. So I recommend you do a loose roll to help manage that fabric so it doesn't fall off over the edge of your sewing table. So while a roll does help eliminate a lot of problems, it can feel a little bit bulkier when you're doing your sewing, and it probably feels like it's a lot heavier than this side of your quilt, because it is. There's a lot more quilt over here. So what I do, instead of guiding my quilt with both hands like this, I'll continue using this hand over here, but I will use this hand to sort of guide and move this portion of the quilt forward. You still want to move in tandem because you don't want to get a wavy line, but it's a little easier to use this sort of as a handle to guide your quilt forward. So as you can see, I finished that first half. Now I can spin it around and work from here out. And then after that, I can work on the perpendicular lines. I want to take a moment to point out that my lines are not perfect. Look, this one didn't quite make it on the line that I marked, and it got a little bit wobbly right here. So when I look at my lines one by one, they're not perfect. But when I zoom out and I look at the quilt as a whole and I see the patterns that those lines made, those little tiny imperfections just sort of fade away, and you're just left with the impression of your whole quilting pattern, all the lines working together to create something lovely. Now, not all quilts are going to be sewn from one edge all the way to the other. Some of them you might want to do some patterns that are contained completely inside your quilt, like I've been echoing these shapes all the way around, and so it makes one complete circuit all inside of my quilt. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're being neat and tidy, not only with the threads, you want to keep them contained and out of the way and out of thread knots, but you also want to keep the finished product as neat as possible too. So technically right here where I started this line of stitches, I could backstitch and just cut my threads off and everything. But I am not a very neat backstitcher. I make a mess of it a lot of the time. So instead, I pull the bobbin thread up through there, and then it looks like this. So I've sewn that line there. So I have my bobbin thread and my top thread up top. And what I'll do is I'll tie a knot between these two threads, and then I'm going to bury those threads inside of the quilt. So they're all neat and tidy and tucked away, and I know that my line of stitching is very secure. I'm going to use my little tension tester to demo this real quick. So I'm going to keep a hold of my top thread. Here's my bobbin thread down here. And I'm going to pick where I want to start my line of quilting. And so on your quilt, you might have it marked or whatever. So I'm just going to imagine it here. So I'm going to use the hand wheel over on the side to advance one whole stitch. So it'll come down and out. Then I'm going to use the top thread to pull the bobbin thread out. Do you see that loop of thread down there? That's the bobbin thread. Then I'm going to use some sort of pointed something to get into that loop and pull the bobbin thread to the top of the fabric. So pretty nice and easy most of the time. Then I'm going to tuck both the bobbin thread and the top thread under the needle, or under the presser foot, sorry. And then I want my needle to go back in exactly where I picked those up. Ideally, you're not moving your quilt top around, but I wanted to show you that. So I'm going to try to hit right there, and then I'm going to lower my presser foot. I'm going to pull this taut so it doesn't get tugged back under and then in the way and make a thread nest and everything. So once I've wrangled these threads and I have a good grip on them, I can start quilting. And I'll quilt as far as I need to go. Let's say I've reached the end of a block right here. I'm going to lift my presser foot and I'm going to go ahead and pull it to the side, getting extra thread here. You might have to reach underneath your quilt to get your bobbin thread, but I'm going to just cut that. So here you have your top thread. All you're going to do is give it just a little bit of a pull, and you can see the bobbin thread poked out, just like that, right down there. And all you're going to do is you're going to grab that and pull it to the top. So there you have your top thread and your bobbin thread. But I do want to point out there's a little bit of a gap between your top thread and your bobbin thread. And so when you're tying your knot, you're going to want to try to get it closer to the bobbin thread hole, just so you don't have a knot that's like randomly on top of your fabric. Now, in order to bury your threads, I'm going to just tie a really quick knot, however you want to do it. But I like to separate the threads and then tie a knot the old-fashioned way, just like that. And I'm going to do that twice. Do a double knot. Okay, now, you're not going to cut your threads here. You want to bury them. So I have a handy-dandy needle covered in fluff for some reason, and I have a needle threader. So I'm going to put the needle threader through the eye of my needle. You could also use self-threading needles if you have them. They would be really, really convenient here. So I'll thread that needle. So to bury this thread, I'm going to go as close as possible to where that first thread came out, and I'm going to go in between the top and the bottom fabric. So I'm right in the batting here. So if you flip it over, you should not be seeing your needle at all. So it's right in the middle, and I'm going to come up a little distance. So there, and I'll pull the thread through. If your knot is still sitting at the top of your fabric, you can give it just a little bit of a tug, and it'll pop through that first layer of fabric and go inside your quilt, and it'll be completely invisible. And then when I cut this thread here, I'm going to be cutting as close as I can to the surface of the quilt without actually cutting the quilt, which I have done, and I was really kicking myself about that. And then you have buried that thread. It's invisible, there's no messy back stitches, and you'll do the same thing down here too. For this improv mini quilt, I'm going to be quilting from edge to edge again, but it's not as obvious where the center is. So I said before, the general rule is to quilt from the center out, and I'm going to be doing curves. So my plan for this one is to find the center of each of my sides, and then I'm going to plot some curves that go from one center point, roughly, very roughly, from one center point to the other, and I'll do all 4 quadrants, and then I'll focus on finishing one quadrant, and then another, and then another. And this is definitely a bit of an experiment on my part because I don't usually quilt without a really firm plan of what I'm going to do. So this is just a way to sort of loosen up and be free with the pattern and sort of see what happens. Because sometimes what you picture in your head is not what you end up with at the end. I should also mention it's a really good idea to keep an eye on how much thread you have left in your bobbin, because it's no fun to run out halfway through your quilting line and you have to panic and figure out how to fix it. And you don't want to do a ton of quilting and realize none of it counted because there was no bobbin thread. Okay, so I'm aiming for sort of an arc. Let's see what happens. So you might notice as I'm sort of gently curving, I'm pushing this hand a little farther ahead and this hand a little farther down. And I'll stop and readjust and try to take aim for the middle. And there I have my first curve. Okay, so I've turned it. Here is my first line of quilting. I'm going to start just a little bit to the side and do the same thing again. And it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be exactly the same on any of the corners. So I finished the first 4 curves for each corner, and I've got some really crazy asymmetry going on. I'm enjoying it. It's nice and loose. And now I'm going to fill in each corner all the way before I skip on to the next corners. And I also have this interesting asymmetrical shape in the center that I'm going to fill in. So I think I'm probably just going to echo inside here. I could do a grid if I wanted to. I could do a circle. I could do a point to point that's just really random. It's completely open-ended. I could choose any kind of motif or whatever to fill it in. So now it's time to listen to an audiobook and zone out while I fill all this in. Large quilts need to be dealt with just a little bit more strategically because of all of this extra fabric. So what I like to do is do a few loose folds to keep it under control and neat and easy to move around. The tighter I fold this, like say I roll this up really tight, I feel like it makes it harder to maneuver around and it becomes sort of more cumbersome. So you have to deal with the extra fabric on the sides, but you also have to deal with all the fabric going down. I've heard of some quilters taking all of this up and throwing it over their shoulder so that it doesn't pull down this way away from the needle so it doesn't cause tension problems. Sometimes I'll do that, especially if it's a really big quilt, but most of the time it's enough to put it on my lap and create a little bit of slack here. So it's not coming straight down like this. I just give it a little bit of room or space to not pull down all the way. So you see, instead of going straight down like this, it's got a little bit of a cushion. Another thing to keep in mind with a large quilt is that all of this extra, it doesn't stay down here for long. It goes back behind your machine. So you need somewhere for it to go. For that reason, I don't like to quilt big quilts at my table facing this wall. I actually move my machine to the kitchen table so that way, instead of butting up into the wall like this, it actually has more length, and that kitchen table is supporting the quilt, so we don't have the opposite problem with it dragging down on this side of the machine. Now let's say you don't have an extension table like this, you just have your machine and it has much less space over here to hold your quilt. You're gonna have to be a little more careful how your fabric drapes over the side here. You're gonna wanna make sure that your fabric isn't falling directly off of that edge. You want to again give it a little bubble, a little cushion. Maybe you're going to fold your quilt a little bit under, and then that will support the quilt top a little bit and keep it more even with the quilting surface or the sewing surface. Basically what you're trying to fight is the pull of your quilt. You're fighting its gravity here, because if it gets too heavy, it's going to be harder to get it through your machine, and it's going to cause tension problems, and your stitch length will be uneven. So fight gravity as much as you can. So here we are. All of the quilting is completely done on each of my mini quilts and my big quilt, and I just want to point out that there is not a single perfect line anywhere. But when you put them all together and when they become part of a larger picture, everything becomes just completely cohesive, and all of a sudden you don't see the flaws anymore. So if you sew your very first line and it does not come out how you expected it, it's not quite as straight as you were hoping for, or whatever the problem might be, I urge you, do not give up, keep going, so you can see that line become part of a bigger picture. Thanks for spending time with me today, quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!